And I understand, speaking of outspoken, you also spoke to Ian Bremmer as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Ian Bremmer conversation, Rochelle, is really a focus on global activity, what is happening with the Russia-Ukraine war, what's happening with the economy. Here's what we put to him.
It's always helpful to have global leaders finding a place to engage and talk together in person, and that's particularly true after a few years when no one was traveling with the pandemic. But let's be clear, having a fragmented world means the WEF is suffering from that fragmentation. I mean, this is the first time in our lifetimes that a member of the G20 has been basically defenestrated, right? They've been decoupled from Europe economically, from the G7, from the wealthy world, and they aren't allowed at Davos. That's a problem, right? They're a major commodities producer for the world, and of course they're also the largest nuclear power in the world. So what we're seeing is a number of rogue states that are becoming more influential on the geopolitical stage that aren't aligned with any of the policy conversations that one would normally have at a forum like this. You also have China, which is not a rogue state, but they're trying to build their own competitive architecture. I mean, they show up here, but this isn't like Belt and Road. It's not like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's not like other organizations that they are building that they intend to be aligned with Chinese market principles, state capitalist principles, Chinese political preferences and priorities. So in that regard, the idea of can we find cooperation is a question mark in a fragmented world. The WEF for 50 years is driving globalization, and increasingly globalization doesn't have the world in it, and that's a problem.
Very small presence here for China, and you just said you don't see China as a rogue state. Why not? Shouldn't they have more people here?
Well, yeah, but the fact they don't have people here doesn't mean that they're a rogue state. I mean, look, rogue state is a country that you are literally disengaged from. U.S. China relations are actually pretty robust in terms of the amount of engagement. It's just there's a lot of competition over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over semiconductors, over human rights issues. But there's also an immense amount of interdependence, as Yahoo Finance knows very well. And most everyone that is at the WEF wants to ensure that you continue to have a level of economic interdependence between those two economies. And also, let's keep in mind, it's not just the private sector. It's also American allies all over the world really don't want to be forced to choose between the United States and China. The Americans are very aware of that. So when Biden met with Xi Jinping at the G20 in Bali just a bit over a month ago, both leaders really tried to put a floor under the existing relationship. So yes, we're going to compete hard. Yes, there are lots of areas that we have zero trust for each other, but that's not going to break the relationship. U.S. China will not become U.S. Russia. That's really important.
Well, I want to get back to Russia for just a second here, because we've entered this pattern now where we're sort of getting used to the situation, both from a market's perspective, a political perspective, that they are this pariah state effectively at this point. Since we are sort of getting used to it, are global markets, global political systems sort of underestimating the threat that it still poses?
Certainly anyone thinking about investing in Europe is underestimating it because it's so structural for the Europeans. First of all, I mean, energy supply is permanently shifted to anything but Russia. Those gas pipelines, which have actually been blown up, Nord Stream 1 and 2, are not coming back online.
And we've been lulled by the warm winter, so it hasn't been as severe as thought. But that's
it's still an expensive
that could change.
And permanent structural change. Well, if anything, it's probably going to get warmer. So, but leaving that aside, the fact that you have millions of refugees from Ukraine living in Poland, housed by the Europeans, that's a big deal. The fact that the Europeans are now going to have to spend vastly more on defense than they had to over the last 30 years. That is a constraint on what they can use their fiscal balances for domestically. That's new. That's a permanent change. And so, I mean, I think what we have to understand is that it's been 30 years of peace dividend that the Europeans have benefited from. It's over. And we're not in a cold war with Russia. We're in a hot war with Russia that we're fighting by proxy in Ukraine. But Russia's ability to use disinformation, to engage in cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, to blow up pipelines or fiber, to have proxy engagement and terrorism on the ground in NATO. Those are now active threats that Europeans principally are going to have to defend themselves against. That is absolutely underpriced in the markets.
Looking at in the U.S., Ian, you write about the divided states of America. Take us through that thesis or that call out, and what does that mean to investors?
It means thankfully less than it used to. The United States, first of all, our top risk list, which is 10 risks a year that we put out at the beginning of every year, it's on the basis of likelihood, imminence, and impact. So the fact that the U.S., the world's most powerful country, the largest economy, is only number 8 means it almost doesn't exist on the list. And that's because you don't have a proximate risk in the U.S. of a constitutional crisis that many had been worried about for 2024 before the result of the midterm elections, when you had all of this potential for election deniers, when Trump looked a lot stronger, all of those things, right? Also, you do have the Americans coming together despite the dysfunction and divide on some significant landmark pieces of legislation. Think about the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. Think about the CHIPS Act, for example. You also have broad consensus on a lot of national security policies, like on Russia, like on China, like on North Korea, like even on Iran, with Democrats and Republicans. Just this morning, I briefed the entire congressional delegation, and the level of alignment between all those Democrats and Republicans on those core foreign policy issues is much greater than you would ever see on cable news. I think that's meaningful.
I want to ask you one final question with regards to the U.S. specifically, and that's on big tech, because you called out sort of the power of individual big tech leaders in your risks as well, although it wasn't on the tippy top, but it was, you discussed it.
Yeah.
From an investment perspective, how much of a risk is that both of regulation coming in, but also that sometimes these people, like in Elon Musk, for example, are unpredictable for investors, et cetera?
I think it's less of an investment risk from a macro U.S. economic perspective. It's more of a risk to U.S. democracy. But the fact is that the United States has attracted the most extraordinary entrepreneurial talent in the world. And I'm very proud to live in a country where that's true. And not all of them were born in the U.S. A lot of them were born in other places. They came to the U.S. because they understood that. That's Elon Musk. That's Jeff Bezos. That's Mark Zuckerberg. It's all these people. But the fact is that those people worth hundreds of billions of dollars also, at the same time, have literally no interest or conception in their role as stewards for civil society and American democracy. That is the different sides of the absolute same coin. And all of America's lionizing free markets and capitalism has also led to a vastly more dysfunctional democratic process, because these companies are inadvertently, but nonetheless, aligning with business models that destroy democracy. And they're exporting it too. That's a very serious problem that right now there is not even the beginning of a regulatory process to address.
So you think those tech CEOs just have too much power, and how does the government reel them in ultimately?
I don't think the government is reeling them in.
Should they though?
Should they? I mean, the question, in this sort of an environment, everyone understands that generative artificial intelligence is a massive problem, deep fakes, disinformation, all the rest. And yet, until you have a major crisis, the people are talking about hundreds of different issues. Democrats, Republicans, they don't agree on what should be done. They don't agree on what the problem is. Some people want to break them up. Some people want to regulate them harder. Some people think it's all about free speech. Some people think it's about woke capitalism. I mean, you pick a congressman, you have a different issue with AI, right? And so I would say until you have a serious crisis. How long did we ignore? Russia war in Ukraine has been going on for almost a decade now, completely ignored until they actually decided they were going to overthrow Zelensky and invade Kiev. We have not come close to that moment yet on AI, and until we do, we're not going to have regulatory response.
You mentioned Elon Musk. Do you think it's, we are running a potential crisis of him running Twitter unchecked?
I wouldn't only focus on Elon Musk and Twitter. I would talk about Facebook. I would talk about TikTok. These are literally platforms where the A/B testing they're doing is about how can we better addict our product. And our product happens to be citizens of the United States and other democracies around the world. There's a reason why the Chinese government hasn't allowed these platforms to exist in their own country. When they do, they're very, very different organizations.
Well, that was Eurasia Group founder Ian Bremmer there, alongside Yahoo Finance's Julie Hyman and Brian Sozzi at Davos.